Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, 1981. Margaret Thatcher is in the United States meeting with newly inaugurated President Ronald Reagan. This was the first time the two of them had gotten together, but not the first time that Thatcher had come to the United States. She was in the U.S. 2 years earlier, meeting with President Carter, and that was, I think we can say, a much chillier affair. With Reagan, though, she was really meeting her counterpart, a Cold War warrior, each trying to navigate their country into a new era of conservatism. The two would continue to have a very close relationship, though it is interesting, and we will get into this, that they did disagree on a number of key decisions, particularly around foreign policy decisions. But let's, at this moment, go to that crisp day in February where the New York Times reported that, quote, Thatcher was greeted at the White House with a 19-gun salute, a flurry of Union Jacks waved by a crowd of several hundred on the South Lawn, and a formal review of an elaborate color guard. And what better guest to have for this episode than Dan Snow, popular British historian, presenter of many history programs on the BBC, and the host of the podcast, Dan Snow's History Hit. Dan, we've been trying to get this podcast cross-pond crossover going for a while, so I'm really glad you're joining us. Thank you for doing this.
I'm honoured, man. It's great to be with US podcasting royalty here. It's exciting. I feel like I'm on the lawn here with flags waving and everything. This
19-gun salute.
Moment.
I can't do that in my basement recording studio, unfortunately.
I forgot my Union Jack. I know.
Yeah. And that voice, of course, is Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt, who is here as always. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson is traveling today, but we soldier on. 19-gun salute. Is that a thing? Is that a thing in the UK?
Seems a few
19?
guns short.
Yeah, right? We usually do 21, right?
I think so. Yeah, yes, this is not a good way to start, but I'm not really sure. I've never really heard of the 19 gun. I think the 21, the monarchy gets the 21, so maybe they just went, oh, mine.
Two people didn't show up for work that day. But Dan, actually, I want to start with this. It's a little far afield, but remember when George W. Bush met Vladimir Putin and said that he looked into Putin's soul and saw a good man? And we should do an episode about that, come to think of it. But it does feel like this meeting between Reagan and Thatcher, it really does scream kind of like soulmates in some way.
Yes, that's a very good point, and particularly because they became soulmates whilst having some pretty significant disagreements, didn't they? And I think they came from a similar place economically, and they had a similar idea about Western liberalism. They had a similar idea about the English-speaking peoples and their sort of existential threat they faced from, at that time, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc. But I would also say, you Americans are very generous to us Brits. Like, from my point of view, the key job of a UK Prime Minister is to put on their best smile, to go to the White House and play nice. And that's why, yes, those two, I think, got on particularly well. But, bear in mind, Tony Blair, who was a left-of-centre British Prime Minister, got on very well, probably natural bedfellows, excuse me, that's not an awkward pun, with Bill Clinton, but then ended up getting on very well with George W. Bush, like the absolute polar opposite. So we are a very junior ally. We depend on you guys for all sorts of things, hard and soft power, economically. Sometimes I don't think we should read too much into just how well these guys are getting on, because it is one of our key performance indicators. Like, do the Americans like this Prime Minister? If not, then something is going badly wrong.
I hesitate to use the word revolutionary in a conversation about British and U.S. relations, but there was something, I think, that tied the two together, and that is this idea of their economic policies not just being kind of on the same page, but also being a sharp break with what came before. And so they come into office as these figures who are affecting pretty significant changes in not just economic policy, but in their argument for the role that government should play in people's lives. Different in some ways, but both believed in a somewhat smaller role.
Yeah, big believers in supply-side economics, the theory that if you slash taxes and regulation, you're going to get growth, it's going to trickle down, everyone's going to benefit. And we're still talking about that today, aren't we? But I think they both did agree with that. Interestingly, of course, Thatcher's had taken power in 79. By 81, things were going really badly in the UK. And so very early on, the mood music, we've forgotten this now, was like a lot of people in the Reagan administration were kind of like, well, I know people aren't really caring that much what's going on in the UK, but like, don't look too much at the UK. It's not an exact parallel for what we're trying to plan here. So initially, then obviously things go much better in the mid to late 80s, and the two of them start to see it in a kind of joint transatlantic way. But it's very funny, like further off the bat, initially, the Reagan administration were like, well, we've got these plans. Yeah, they're similar to what Thatcher's done in the UK, but don't look too closely. Also, the context is very important.
And in terms of their respective roles in the sort of public imagination within the respective countries, I mean, Reagan, this is incredibly simplistic, right? But we have Morning in America as the sort of Reagan watchword. Let's turn a page. Let's become hopeful again. And, I think the sort of Iron Lady, grit your teeth, austerity kind of approach. I mean, is that a fair characteristic? And is there a disconnect there between their two just kind of dispositions and approaches in the story they're telling their country?
Yeah, Jody, I think you're right. Both of those two narratives assume that for various reasons the mid to late 70s was like a sort of nadir. Yeah. In the US, you have the oft lamented sort of travails of the Carter administration, the hostages, etc. But also you have this sense of post-Vietnam, post-Watergate malaise a little bit. You have, and then a sort of an economic downturn as well. In the UK, you get this very real sense that in the 1970s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s marks the retreat from global hegemony, from empire, it's disaster. Now, this has been challenged by historians since then, but Thatcher and the Conservative Party today actually are still quite keen to push this, and that Thatcher then was able to kind of get a grip, break the power of the unions here in the UK, sort of instill a robust sort of work ethic, as I say, slashing, rolling back the state, forcing people to stand on their own 2 feet. This is the narrative, I think, that you're right, that they both were keen to push at the time and subsequently.
I mean, it does seem like union busting feels like a place where they could have found common ground, right? I mean, Reagan famously, intervenes with the air controllers, and I mean, that was a huge theme for the early Thatcher years, right?
Huge thing. And of course here, the like Reagan's fight with the air controllers, the sort of totemic battle that he picked, I think here in the UK it would be the coal miners, the terrible fights and strikes and hardship for that community, as Thatcher deliberately made a decision to break the power of that traditionally very powerful union, or a couple of unions, because they had, in the early 1970s, a series of energy crises in the UK, and Thatcher decided to make a dash for gas, to change Britain's energy mix, and that meant calling the bluff of the miners and not giving into their demands and things. So yeah, that came to define, as well as the Falklands War, which we ended up talking about, but that sort of defined Thatcher's early part of her term.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that foreign policy side of things, because on the one hand, you think of Reagan and Thatcher as committed Cold Warriors, folks who should be mostly on the same page. But when it comes to actions that the countries are taking, like the Falkland War, like the invasion of Grenada, and some other actions later in the 1980s, they do seem, at least behind the scenes, to be cautioning one another about the actions that they're taking and having these disagreements. I mean, what accounts for those kinds of differences between the two?
I thought they were in a competition for how small and obscure of an island can you send troops to.
That's I hadn't thought about that. I think it's, there's that old Palmerston expression, I think it's Palmerston who says, nations have no friends, they have interests. And what I think interesting is that you get Thatcher and Reagan both think it's important to maintain the Western alliance, basically, particularly the heart of the Western alliance, the English-speaking nations, one in Europe, one in North. They're sort of the Anglo-US relationship, which is a kind of big component of that Western alliance. But underneath that's the headline. But underneath that, there are many frustrations, and one of the frustrations is that the rhetoric, the actions never quite match up to that rhetoric. The idea that Brits, I mean, I have a little game here in the UK. Whenever anyone talks about special relationship, I whatever the opposite of to have a shot, like I just throw myself off a cliff or something. Like it's so meaningless. Like actually, it's quite meaningless. And one of the reasons it's meaningless is you see here, yes, that the mood music is great, joined by language, joined by tradition. Thatcher and Reagan can make nice. There are obviously strong cultural and even familial links between Britain and America. But really, on the ground, like when it came to the Falklands, Thatcher was like astonished that the US wouldn't take this, or just unambiguously take the side of the Brits. This was a military dictatorship that invaded sovereign territory of another nation. Falkland Islands has been British for longer than California had been American, for example. And actually Thatcher compares the Falklands to Alaska. He says, I wonder if she actually said, I've got the transcript of a call in May '82. I wonder if anyone over there realised. I'd like to ask them. Just supposing Alaska was invaded. And Reagan says, well, I don't think Alaska is a similar situation. But actually to the Brits, to Thatcher, they thought it was a very similar situation. And not getting the full-throated support of the US was a bitter blow to the Brits. However, you've got to continue to make nice, because what are you going to do? What are the Brits going to do? Say, okay, well, we're going to stop buying your defense equipment, or we're going to stop hosting your missiles, keeping up. We are forced into these little indignities in order to preserve the kind of wider relationship. And I think Thatcher was aware of that, and it meant that behind the scenes they would have these fallings out. I mean, the other one, as you say, Grenada was amazing. She said it caused the gravest concern, that, and she outlined all these various points that she was worried about. But it didn't stop there. She was worried about some of the approaches that Reagan made to Gorbachev. She thought there was issues around, might be the abolition of nuclear weapons, which she was very worried about. This is Thatcher, as with all the B-list cast. It is you're trying to manipulate Reagan, and the way of doing that is to kind of profess undying friendship and make nice, but whilst also desperately trying to push back on areas of kind of detailed policy that you fundamentally disagree with.
Well, on that front, I mean, you can refer to your own country as B-list in this moment. We won't. But on that end, I mean, I think Reagan certainly thought of himself as having the weight of a global struggle on his shoulders. And, when you read about, I made a joke about invading Grenada, but when you read about the kind of logic behind that, it really does feel like the administration had convinced himself that invading Grenada was part of this existential struggle. Where did Thatcher see herself and the UK in that battle?
I think the Brits had realised, unlike the French, the Brits realised that their only pathway to agency was by slipstreaming as close as possible with the American. I'm looking for the metaphor there. What do you slipstream behind?
A cycler, yeah.
Or like great flying object. And I think that Thatcher and that generation of politicians were never naive enough to think that they could chart a kind of third way. Now, interestingly, today's Brexiteers believed, some of them, the ones that even less detached from reality than the majority of them, believed that somehow Britain could sort of somehow re-establish some kind of weird global role as in a multipolar world, and they got kind of hot and excited about that. I think in the 1980s it was very clear there were two games in town here. It was the Soviet bloc versus the American-led bloc, and your best chance of having any agency was to try and influence American policy from a position of intimacy. And so therefore, over Grenada, when Americans took kind of unilateral action against a part of the world where traditionally Britain had an interest and was sort of once part of the British Empire, Thatcher was just, I think, upset that she hadn't been involved, upset that she was nervous that the invasion of a small defenceless island might bring the overall coalition. I think she was worried about the moral high ground a little bit. And she was probably right that in this existential struggle to paint the other side as evil, which I think she and Reagan believed in kind of simple terms they were, then you should be mindful of your own reputation and that kind of soft power. And in a way, I guess not unlike perhaps the role that Tony Blair tried to play with George Bush over Iraq, sort of trying to go down a UN route, trying to present a softer, more collegiate face to some of those more harsh neocon realities. But then again, on some issues, she was pretty tough. Like, I think she was nervous of perhaps she was jealous, but there was a nervousness around Gorbachev and Reagan going too far towards Entente. I think she was nervous about that. And she was nervous, for example, on the issue of nuclear weapons. Like, was Reagan going to overpromise, like overcompromise on nuclear weapons? Because, again, the terror of Western Europeans has been, and we have this at the moment, we had it with Trump, let me tell you, that the terror of Western Europeans is that you're always worried that the American Leviathan is going to get bored, is going to turn in on itself as it did after the First World War. Memories of that are long. And so you need America engaged in Europe. You need America's security umbrella. But the Americans, they do have these ideas, and you have to try and restrain them where possible, darling. And I think that's the kind of dance that Thatcher and others have played.
It's so striking because, in the U.S. as well, there were factions within the Republican Party and on the right who shared a lot of Thatcher's same anxieties for different reasons sometimes, but that Reagan was going to be a little too soft on Gorbachev, that he had transformed from this cold warrior into this kind of like milquetoast, kind of willing to compromise international figure. And one of the things I think that points to is we tend to link Thatcher and Reagan because they're both conservative, but conservatism is a broad church, and so
we've seen that recently, haven't we?
So there are differences that play out that aren't just about different interests, but also could be ideological differences within the conservative realm as well.
Then everyone who listens to this show knows that eventually we just turn every conversation into a media conversation, and so this is me asking you a question about, the media environment that brought Thatcher to power and how she navigated that. Because I think, I've certainly in the last few years, and I've worked on a couple projects about Reagan, but really come to understand him as a, perfect product of a particular shifting media ecosystem. And obviously he was an actor, and when he entered the White House, they literally just put marks on the ground because he knew how to hit a mark and he knew how to stand in the right place for the cameras and so forth. But, obviously media was changing, and Niki has written about this brilliantly. But how much was she a product of the media? Was she good at sort of navigating a radically changing media environment in the 1980s?
Well, first of all, as a fan of this podcast, I enjoy the media nature of it very much. And of course, you're totally right. You look at the rise of fascism in the 20th century, those were media players. You look at, and indeed communism, you look at the role that changing technology played in establishing those authoritarian regimes across Europe. You look at media more recently with Trump's use of social media. And you're of course completely right. And Thatcher was the increasing importance of TV. Her image was very carefully crafted. She, as a woman, had a unique disadvantages, of course, because of inbuilt the patriarchy, but she had some advantages as well in terms of her ability to dress in a powerful way. She tended to surround herself with men visually, so it made her look, drew attention to her. She was, I think, quite conscious of that. In a way, I'm sure that actually Queen Elizabeth I would have done, Queen Elizabeth Tudor, in a way, perhaps in her court. She was a conservative, but she was a blue-collar conservative. She came from small-town Britain, a kind of the artisanal, mercantile, hard-working, religious middle class, as you'd refer to it in America, but actually not here in the UK, where middle class means kind of professorial and upper middle class. It means kind of something else in here in the UK. And she would be filmed going to the grocery store and doing a weekly grocery shop and being insisting that the books should be balanced. I only spend what's coming in is what's going out. Kind of earthy conservative values like that. So I think that it was hugely important. And the Conservatives also have a ton of money, and so they pioneer a lot of these campaign techniques and just borrowed directly from the US. So those early Conservative Party conferences, which were quite staid events, they started to look a lot more like conventions. With balloons and flags and music and all the rest of the things that you guys pioneered. So I think there's that's a hugely important part of creating.
It's funny. I mean, you'd think she would get along with Carter, right? In terms of like, you could see Carter going to a grocery store, right? Whereas the Reagans, I think, cultivated this sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of Hollywood royalty kind of aesthetic, right? And I don't think would ever have gone to a grocery store, and certainly might not have known what to do if they entered one.
Well, there's that different tradition of the class traitor, right? Which is Trump at 16. We forget he said, "I'm going to raise tax on myself." You know, he's like, "I know how this works. I was one of these guys." And you see a couple of Democrats. You know, that's the other play, isn't it? You go, actually. I am a member of the elite. I'm super loaded, but I'm going to come in and just share my largesse and knowledge with you guys. You're very lucky, and I think those are the kind of, you see those trends.
Right. Although I don't know if that's ever really worked successfully in this country. I'm trying to think.
I wonder in the States. You know more than I do. I wonder if it's kind of Rooseveltian.
Right.
Maybe I think to myself occasionally. Maybe there's some patrician. I don't know. It's like some of those scary pre-Second World War US presidents I kind of get mixed up about, like Hoover. I don't know if did that work maybe a little more back then. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it certainly did in the 1930s. And there was a whole generation in the 1930s of also these $1-a-year men who were so wealthy they didn't have to take a salary from the government. And so those ideas of kind of public service were slightly different, I think.
Yeah. All right. As we start to wrap up, I'm just curious, you know, in a sort of bigger sense. I mean, we talked about it on the show, and you know, I've worked on a number of projects that kind of get at this, and then Niki's work has certainly advanced this. But you know, I really do think there is this feeling that we are living in a world that was, in many ways, the parameters of the world we're living in were defined in the Reagan era, and then you know, shifted and advanced, and certainly in the way that Niki has written into the 90s. And I'm curious how much modern British politics feels like it's living in a world that was defined during the Thatcher era.
We trail the US in so many ways, and we do in this respect as well. I think slightly less dramatically, but certainly that the sort of, if you like, the extent to which it's manufactured or not, but that's the perception of crisis in the late 1970s, and then the return of prosperity and the end of the Cold War in the 80s. Has conditioned an entire generation, for sure, of people, particularly on the right, around the importance of decisions that were made by Reagan and by Thatcher in our countries respectively. And I think in both of our countries you see, and again more so of course in the States, but you see the breakdown of that post-war consensus around welfare state, around the purpose of government, around the desire to use the state in order to achieve some greater degree of equality in outcomes. And I think that is, as we know in the States, is under very real attack, despite what your representatives all shouted in the chamber the other day at Joe Biden. And in Britain to a lesser extent, that entitlement, you know, getting a grip on entitlement spending, that those, I think the people pushing those ideas came of age in the 80s, were hugely influenced, have absorbed the kind of hagiography of Reagan and Thatcher, not looked at some of the more, you know, both of them were deeply pragmatic, in fact, and made kind of deeply contradictory, you know, moves, depending on, because as you do when you're in charge, you have to do things as the situations present themselves.
But did Thatcher ever say something like, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem?
Yeah. She once said there's no such thing as society, and people have argued about exactly what she meant by that. But you know, so she said things. She said the famous. In fact, the fact that I even know all this stuff shows that it's permeated British our conversations. You know, she talked about if you're on the bus, if you're riding the bus as a middle-aged person, you've basically failed in life, right? You should be in a car and you should live in the suburbs and you should be taking some control. She said there's no such thing as society. You know, she was absolutely, she regarded government as something that could infantilize and create dependency, and which of course you guys have got there. She had the another thing that she could tilt at, which as well as Washington, which she had Brussels, so she had Europe. So that's and that despite the fact that she pioneered in many ways, she was hugely important in Europe and in its kind of fairly we forget in the 80s, the Labour Party was actually kind of opposed to Europe because they thought Thatcher was turning Europe into a kind of capitalist project, a free market project, you know, dropping trade barriers and allowing trade to flow and capital to flow, people to flow, becoming kind of a rootless capitalist society. In fact, she came to see Europe weirdly as an enemy in that respect. So that's an element that isn't there in the States, of course.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Dan, as I said, we've been trying to get you on the show for a long time. This has been really wonderful, and thank you for doing this. And of course, Dan has his podcast, History Hit, but of course there's the whole History Hit network. Tons of great shows there, so go check it out. We'll put a link in our show description, and we'll tweet it out and all that stuff. But Dan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys. It's an honor.
Yeah. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
We are bound by common language and linked in history. We share laws and literature, blood and moral fiber. The responsibility for freedom is ours to share.
Others, like you, Mr. President, are stirred by the challenge. America's successes will be our successes. Your problems will be our problems. And when you look for friends, we will be there.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia from